I'm a 17-year-old guy, currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip in the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you post stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, and usually with a lot of trash and loud music. Anyway, this particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through the canyon. Pretty simple in and out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancel on his part left me on my own. So with a packed bag and a car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time and some trouble navigating the rough forest roads, I didn't arrive to the trailhead until 5:45, which for those of you who don't backpack, this is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-hour hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast, so I figured if I moved quick enough, I could get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own, with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was, and being on my own only amplified this. Eventually, it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and get a camp set up. With only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot, but there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood, and I got a fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac I had brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good. My camp was set up and my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike in had almost gone away, but it was still there. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees with a trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything on the edge of that circle and past it are pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating my dinner when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I looked at the tiny rock in shock, as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light on and towards the area where I had seen the rock come from, but due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for what or whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray too far from my fire that in hindsight offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or it had fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible if you weren't listening for them, but they were still there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened as the rustling of the leaves got harder to hear, so I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had next to me when I had fallen asleep. The more I looked, the more scared I got, as I came to realize that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I've almost shit my pants. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me, past the tree line, in the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options. Stay here and wait out the night, or attempt the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever or whoever was out there with me was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light. So I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night there. Eventually it came back. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could hear it. It sounded like someone leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk away too far and I would lose the sound of its steps. But then, an hour later, maybe two, it would return, still faint as ever. This went on for about 3 or 4 hours until I listened to the steps get closer and closer until they were about 7 feet from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small, as I had run out of wood on my pile. The footsteps stopped, and everything went totally silent. I sat there still, for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand, and prayed that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and speed walked the 3 miles back down the trail I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in, and drove and didn't stop until I put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read what was written in the dust on my back window of my car. Sleep well? A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and scariest by far, so I thought I would share it. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can. This story is unfortunately true. I grew up in the Sierra Nevada area. I wasn't big on camping, but spent a good chunk of my childhood weekends hiking with family and friends. The summer that I was 16, about 10 years ago, now my cousin C had come back from her first year at college, and her boyfriend Jay was visiting. Jay wanted to go on a hike with lake views, and C and I knew just the one. It was one of our favorites. The 3 of us set out on this hike. The trail isn't the easiest to find, but it's really popular with locals because of the view and general lack of tourists. We saw a couple of hikers with dogs. It's an in-and-out trail that takes about 2 to 3 hours to the top, 2 to 3 hours back down. There are some smaller trails that branch off. We make it to the top in good time and enjoy our lunches overlooking the lake. After about an hour, we hear a scream in the distance. Specifically, a mountain lion scream. If you've never heard a mountain lion scream, it's really unnerving. It sounds a bit like a very loud, terrified woman screaming. This is not good, because when a mountain lion screams, it's part of a mating ritual. That means there are multiple mountain lions and close. The bears in the Sierras are softies, but the mountain lions will attack you. They'll attack your pets. They've even been known to attack bikers. Jay was really freaked out. C and I were wary, but it wasn't the first time we had heard mountain lions, and we had both seen them before. There was also an incident where, as kids, we laid out some expensive steak in my backyard in hopes of luring mountain lions to take pictures. C and I tell Jay that we need to pack it up and get back down the mountain. About 40 minutes into the hike back, Jay realized that he forgot his phone at the lookout in his rush to leave. Of course, we decided that C and Jay would hike back up to retrieve his phone, and I would stay there, on the trail, to warn any other potential hikers that there are lions in the area. This is obviously not ideal for us, but seemed like the best choice at the time. I found a nice rock to sit on by the trail, and was going through the pictures we took. C and Jay had been gone for about 50 minutes when I heard the scream again, and it's hard to tell, but I think it's closer than before. I start to freak out, because being alone is not good if the lion is nearby. About 20 minutes after that, I hear the scream again, and there is now zero doubt that it is closer. Logically, I know that lions don't scream when hunting. They are quiet. If a lion was hunting me, I wouldn't know it. That knowledge did not make me less scared. A couple minutes after that, I hear it again, extremely close by. I'm looking around and trying to find the best place for me to stand, back covered, in case of the worst. Suddenly, I see something out of the corner of my eye. Standing still, 20 feet down the trail, a couple feet off of it, is a man. He's completely naked. He's filthy. He's skinny. And he's just standing there, looking at me. If you don't know where you're going, it's easy to get lost in the woods around there. And it doesn't take long, being alone, lacking food and water in the wilderness, to make people a little disoriented, a little crazy. My immediate response is that this man is probably a lost hiker, and judging by how dirty he was, he's been lost a long time. He needs help. I started walking towards him, asking if he's okay. I suddenly get this feeling of wrongness. I don't know how else to describe it, but the hair stood up on my neck. I stopped in my tracks, maybe 15 feet away now, and had the overwhelming urge to run. It seemed wrong. He looked wrong in a way I can't quite articulate. Instead of wanting to help, I'm now scared. I ask again if he's okay. He looks at me, then opens his mouth wide and screams. Not a normal scream. He screamed so loudly. Worse, it sounded like the scream of the mountain lion. It occurred to me that we were probably hearing him the whole time. It was the single most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. I started screaming too. Why was he standing there screaming? Do I run? Do I get out the bear mace? Suddenly, he closed his mouth, turned around, and ran into the woods very quickly. He disappeared into the trees, but the feeling of wrongness was still with me. I considered bolting down the trail, but decided to wait for C and J, who luckily arrived within 10 or 15 minutes. I told them what happened, and we decided to call it in to the rangers when we got service. I've always been left with the unsettling question. Did I see a mentally ill lost hiker who really needed my help? Or did I see something else? Something not human, mimicking the call of a mountain lion and stalking us down the mountain. I wasn't sure where to post this, but I needed validation that I'm not insane. I've never really had paranormal experiences, but I cannot explain this. I'm in college, and me and 7 other people from my school went on a backpacking trip, and we had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Zaleski State Forest, which is in the Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold, and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple other groups of people as well. A few of them were friendly older couples, and then 2 college-aged girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other. We set up camp further away from everyone else. I have always been able to sense energies of places, and the energy in this area wasn't great. It was almost spooky. Each of us had individual one-person tents, and we formed kind of a cluster in this site, with my tent being in the back, so no one was behind me. Our cluster was also right next to the forest, because this backpacking site was like a big cleared off square in the middle of the trees. Fast forward, I'm dead asleep around 2 a.m., and I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had a sort of heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog. Also, it sounded like just 2 legs. I cannot make this up. This creature was circling my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping up to the sides of my tent, and then just stopping for periods of time, and then it would move on to walking around the rest of our tent cluster. I could hear human-like breathing from the mouth when it was close to my tent, like a light sort of heaving. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent to investigate. I kid you not, this occurred for hours, and it seemed like I was the only one awake. Out of nowhere, I see an illuminated light shape from my tent, although I couldn't tell what it was from inside my tent. because it was all zipped up. It was like a warm glow, and it didn't move like a flashlight would. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe it was an animal. At some point I fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the heavy footsteps circling until I did. In the morning, I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted she heard the footsteps and noises as well, admitting it was bizarre, and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in my group said he also noticed the light that came on, but thought it was someone else. Not a single person in this group went up to go to the bathroom or turned on the light that night. I've heard things about the Appalachian region being creepy and bizarre, and now I believe it. Some people on Reddit have leaned towards Bigfoot, because apparently he is associated with light orbs. Never been a Bigfoot believer, but I'm telling you, this didn't feel like just any animal, like a bear.